A waitress saw someone spike the drink of a millionaire dining alone, and when she warned him and refused his massive tip afterward, the promise she asked for instead would change both their lives forever. Before we start the story, tell us in the comments what city you are watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. She stood in the courtroom, her hands trembling as the judge read the verdict that would seal her fate. The man who'd once sat alone in that restaurant booth now sat in the gallery, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. And when the gavel came down, when the word guilty echoed through the chamber, he rose from his seat and did something nobody least of all her could have predicted. He walked straight to the defense table, looked her dead in the eyes, and whispered the 4 words that would either save her or destroy them both. "I'm keeping my promise." But to understand how a split-second decision in a half-empty restaurant led to a moment that would test the very limits of loyalty and redemption, we have to go back to a Tuesday night when the rain wouldn't stop falling, and a woman who'd learned to expect nothing from life was about to risk everything. The rain hammered against the windows of Calloway's bistro like it had a personal vendetta against the glass. It was one of those November storms that rolled into the city without warning, turning the streets into rivers and the sidewalks into obstacle courses of overflowing gutters and abandoned umbrellas. Inside the restaurant, the warm glow of Edison bulbs and the soft murmur of jazz did their best to keep the gloom at bay. But on a Tuesday night like this, with the weather doing its worst, the dining room was barely half full. Claire Donovan didn't mind the slow nights. In fact, she preferred them. Less chaos meant fewer opportunities for mistakes. And mistakes, well, mistakes had a way of costing her tips she couldn't afford to lose. She moved through the restaurant with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this too long, her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished hardwood as she cleared table 7 and reset it for the next guest who probably wouldn't come. She was 28 years old, though some days she felt 50. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had started the shift neat and orderly, but now looked like it had been through a wind tunnel. A few rebellious strands stuck to her forehead, damp with the humidity that seeped in every time the front door opened. Her uniform, a simple black button-down and slacks, was standard issue for Calloway's, which liked to market itself as upscale casual. Translation: expensive enough to make you feel fancy, casual enough that you wouldn't get kicked out for wearing jeans. Claire had been working here for 3 years. 3 years of smiling at customers who didn't see her, memorizing orders for people who'd forget her face the moment they walked out, and pretending that the ache in her feet and the exhaustion in her bones were just part of the job. Because they were. This was the job, and she needed it. "Table 12 needs water," Jenna called out from behind the bar, her voice cutting through the music. Jenna was the bartender, a woman in her early 40s with bleached blonde hair and a smoker's rasp that made everything she said sound like a threat. She wasn't mean exactly, just worn down, like a stone that had been kicked around too many times. "On it," Claire replied, grabbing a pitcher from the service station and heading toward the back corner of the restaurant. Table 12. Of course it was Table 12. That booth had become something of a fixture on Tuesday nights, and so had its occupant. His name was Grayson Hill, though Claire hadn't learned that from him. She'd learned it from the whispers that followed him like a shadow every time he walked through the door. Grayson Hill, founder and CEO of Hill Capital Management. Net worth somewhere in the 9-figure range, depending on which business magazine you believed. He owned half the skyline, or so the rumors said, and he could buy Calloway's Bistro 10 times over without even checking his bank balance. But you wouldn't know it by looking at him. Not really, he always came alone. Always ordered the same thing. A bourbon, neat, and the chef's special. whatever it happened to be that night. He never made a fuss, never demanded attention, and he tipped exactly 20%, not a dollar more, not a dollar less. It was like he'd calculated the socially acceptable amount and decided that was enough. Claire had served him maybe a dozen times over the past few months. He was polite, in that distant, distracted way that wealthy people often were. He'd nod when she brought his drink, murmur a quiet, "Thank you," when she delivered his food, and then he'd disappear into whatever world existed inside his head. Sometimes he'd have his phone out, scrolling through emails or messages with the kind of focus that made it clear the rest of the room didn't exist. Other times, he'd just sit there staring at nothing, his jaw tight and his eyes shadowed with something Claire couldn't quite name. Loneliness, maybe. Or regret? She didn't know. And she didn't ask. That wasn't her job. Tonight, he was already seated when she approached, his gray suit jacket draped over the back of the booth and his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked tired. More than tired, he looked like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to sleep without waking up in the middle of the night with his mind already racing. "Evening." "Mr. Hill," Claire said, setting the water glass down in front of him. She'd learned his name from the reservation book, though he'd never introduced himself. "Bourbon? Neat?" He glanced up, and for just a second, his eyes met hers. They were dark, so dark they were almost black, and there was something in them that made her chest tighten. Not in a romantic way, not even in a particularly human way. It was the look of someone who'd built walls so high and so thick that even he couldn't see over them anymore. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Thanks." She nodded and turned to head back to the bar, but something made her pause. Maybe it was the way his shoulders slumped forward, just a fraction. Maybe it was the way his hand rested on the table, fingers tapping out an aimless rhythm like he was trying to distract himself from his own thoughts. Or maybe it was just that she'd seen that look before. She'd seen it in the mirror often enough. "Long day?" she asked before she could stop herself. He blinked, surprised. Like he wasn't used to people asking. Something like that. "Well," Claire said, offering a small smile, "the bourbon should help." His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Here's hoping." She left him alone after that, heading back to the bar to grab his drink. Jenna was already pouring it, her movements quick and efficient as she wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "He's here again," Jenna said. "Not looking up?" "Yep." "You ever wonder what a guy like that does with all that money?" Claire shrugged. "Probably the same thing the rest of us do. Just with better furniture," Jenna snorted. "You're probably right." Claire carried the bourbon back to table 12, setting it down with the same practiced care she gave every drink. Grayson didn't look up. He was staring at his phone now, his brow furrowed like whatever he was reading had personally offended him. "Chef's special tonight is pan-seared salmon with roasted vegetables," Claire said. "Sound good?" "Yeah, that's fine." She made a note on her pad and turned to leave, but then she saw him. A man, mid-30s maybe. Sandy blonde hair slicked back with too much gel, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was sitting 2 booths over, nursing a glass of red wine and pretending to look at his phone. But he wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at Grayson, and then he moved. It happened fast. Too fast for most people to notice. The man stood, stretched like he was working out a kink in his back, and started walking toward the restrooms. But as he passed Grayson's booth, his hand dipped low, hovering over the bourbon glass for just a fraction of a second. Claire's heart stopped. She didn't think. She didn't have time to think. She just moved. "Mr. Hill," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "I'm so sorry, but I think I grabbed the wrong bottle. Let me get you a fresh drink." She reached for the glass, her hand closing around it before Grayson could protest. He looked up at her, confusion flickering across his face, but she didn't give him time to ask questions. She just smiled bright and fake and too wide and took the glass back to the bar. Her hands were shaking. Jenna frowned. What the hell, Claire? You just poured that. I know, Claire said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She set the glass down on the counter, her pulse hammering in her ears. Don't drink it. Don't let anyone drink it. Jenna's eyes widened. What are you talking about? Claire glanced over her shoulder. The blond man was back in his booth now, his expression calm and unbothered. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just. She turned back to Jenna. Call the manager and maybe the cops. I don't know. Just don't touch that glass. Then she grabbed a fresh bourbon, her hands still trembling, and walked back to table 12. Grayson was watching her now, his dark eyes sharp and assessing. He wasn't distracted anymore. He was focused. On her, is there a problem? He asked. Claire set the new drink down, her voice low and steady despite the way her heart was trying to claw its way out of her chest. I think someone just tried to spike your drink. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. And for the first time since she'd started working at Calloway's, Claire saw Grayson Hill's mask slip. His jaw clenched. His eyes went hard, and when he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his hands were perfectly steady. Stay here, he said quietly, his voice like ice. Then he made a call, and Claire realized, with a cold shiver of dread, that this night was far from over. The next 10 minutes unfolded like a scene from a movie Claire never wanted to be in. Grayson's phone call lasted maybe 30 seconds. He spoke in a low, clipped tone, the kind of voice that didn't ask for things. It commanded them. Claire couldn't hear everything he said, but she caught fragments. Calloway's Bistro. Now. Yes, both of them. And call Detective Morrison. Tell him it's not a request. When he hung up, he looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the distracted glance of a regular customer acknowledging the help. This was different. His eyes swept over her face like he was memorizing every detail, cataloging her features in case he needed to recall them later. What's your name? He asked. Claire. Claire Donovan. He nodded slowly. Claire, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. So she did. She told him about the man with the slicked back hair, about the way he'd paused as he walked past the booth, about the millisecond where his hand had hovered over the glass. She told him it had happened so fast, she almost wasn't sure she'd seen it at all. Almost. But you were sure enough to grab the glass, Grayson said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Claire's voice was steadier now, though her hands were still shaking. She'd tucked them behind her back so he wouldn't see. Yeah, I was sure enough. Something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe. Or gratitude. It was hard to tell with a man who'd clearly spent years learning how to keep his emotions locked away in a vault. Where is he now? Grayson asked, his gaze sliding past her toward the dining room. Claire turned slightly, trying not to be obvious about it. The blond man was still in his booth, still nursing his wine like he had all the time in the world. He looked bored, relaxed, like he was just another diner waiting out the rain. 2 booths over, she said quietly. Still there, Grayson's jaw tightened. Good. He's not going anywhere. And that's when the front door opened. 2 men walked in, and Claire knew immediately they weren't customers. They moved with a kind of fluid precision that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Both wore dark suits and earpieces, and their eyes swept the room in a coordinated pattern that screamed professional security. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped black hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. The other was leaner, shorter, but he moved like a coiled spring, all-controlled energy, just waiting to be released. They spotted Grayson instantly and made their way to table 12, weaving through the sparse crowd without drawing much attention. Most of the other diners didn't even look up, but Claire noticed, and she noticed the way the blond man's posture shifted ever so slightly, the way his hand moved closer to his jacket pocket. Mr. Hill, the taller man said, his voice low and professional. We got here as fast as we could. Carter. Bridger. Grayson gestured toward Claire without looking away from his security team. "This is Claire Donovan. She just saved my life." The words landed like a punch to Claire's gut. Saved his life. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. She'd just reacted, just done what felt right in the moment. But hearing him say it out loud made the reality of the situation crash down on her like a freight train. Someone had tried to drug him, maybe kill him, and she'd stopped it. "Holy hell! Ma'am," Carter the tall one said, nodding at her with something that looked like respect. "Can you point out the individual in question?" Claire swallowed hard and gestured toward the blond man. 2 booths back, sandy hair, dark jacket. "He's the one." Bridger's eyes locked onto the target, and Claire saw his jaw tighten. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." That was all they needed. What happened next was efficient and terrifying in equal measure. Carter moved toward the bar, positioning himself near the exit like a silent sentinel. Bridger approached the blond man's booth with the kind of calm, unhurried confidence that made it clear he'd done this before. "Many times." "Excuse me, sir," Bridger said, his tone polite but utterly devoid of warmth. "I'm going to need you to come with me." The blond man looked up, his expression shifting from boredom to confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me. Let's make this easy." And just like that, the man's mask dropped. His eyes went cold, calculating. His hand moved toward his jacket, and for one heart-stopping second, Claire thought he was going for a weapon. But Carter was faster. He crossed the room in 3 strides and clamped a hand down on the man's shoulder, pinning him in place with the kind of grip that looked casual but was clearly anything but. "Hands on the table," Carter said quietly. "Now!" The blond man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the exit. But there was nowhere to go. Carter's grip tightened, and with his free hand, he reached into the man's jacket and pulled out a small vial clear liquid, maybe half an ounce. He held it up to the light, his expression darkening. "Well," Carter said, his voice dripping with contempt, "looks like we've got a winner." By now, the other diners were starting to notice. Conversations trailed off. Heads turned. A woman at table 6 clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with alarm. The manager, a flustered man in his 50s named Paul, came rushing out from the back, his face pale. "What's going on here?" Paul demanded, though his voice lacked any real authority. "Call the police," Grayson said, standing up from his booth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Tell them we're holding someone for attempted poisoning." Paul's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. What are you serious?" "Dead serious." And then the blond man made his move. He lunged sideways, trying to break free from Carter's grip, but it was like trying to break free from a vice. Carter slammed him back down into the booth, his forearm pressed against the man's chest, and leaned in close. "Try that again," Carter said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I'll make sure you leave here on a stretcher. Understood?" The man's bravado crumbled. His face went pale, and he nodded jerkily, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Claire stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like she was trapped in someone else's nightmare. Her pulse was racing, her hands clammy, and she felt like the walls of the restaurant were closing in on her. This wasn't supposed to happen. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. She was a waitress. She served food and smiled and went home exhausted and alone. She wasn't supposed to be in the middle of whatever this was, but then Grayson was standing next to her, and his hand, warm and steady, rested lightly on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw something other than walls and distance in his eyes. She saw concern. Real, human concern. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I really don't know." "You did the right thing," Grayson said. "I need you to know that." She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. The police arrived 8 minutes later, 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective who introduced himself as Morrison. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from spending too many years dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. He took one look at the scene, listened to Carter's rapid-fire rundown, and then turned his attention to Claire. "You're the one who spotted it?" Morrison asked. "Yeah." "And you're sure about what you saw?" "Positive." Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "All right, I'm going to need a full statement from you. And we'll need to test that glass." Jenna, who'd been hovering near the bar, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past 15 minutes, carefully handed over the bourbon glass she'd been guarding like a dragon protecting its hoard. Morrison took it with gloved hands and passed it to one of the officers, who sealed it in an evidence bag. The blond man was handcuffed and led out of the restaurant, his head down and his shoulders hunched. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at Grayson. But Claire saw the hate in his eyes as the officers hauled him through the front door and into the rain, and she knew, with a cold certainty that settled in her bones, that this wasn't over. An hour later, after she'd given her statement to Detective Morrison and answered what felt like 1,000 questions, Claire found herself sitting in the manager's office with a cup of lukewarm coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. Paul had sent her back here to decompress, though she suspected he really just wanted her out of the dining room so the remaining customers wouldn't be reminded of the drama. She was staring at the scuffed linoleum floor, her mind still replaying the moment she'd seen the man's hand hover over Grayson's glass when there was a knock on the door. "Come in," she said, expecting Paul or maybe Jenna, but it was Grayson. He'd put his suit jacket back on, and he looked every inch the powerful CEO the rumors painted him to be. But there was something different about him now, something softer. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, like he wasn't quite sure what to say. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally. "Properly," Claire shook her head. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. Actual paper checks, like it was still 1995. "I want to give you something. For what you did." "Mr. Hill, I don't—" "Grayson," he interrupted. "Call me Grayson. And please, just let me do this." He clicked a pen and started writing, his handwriting surprisingly neat for someone who probably spent most of his time typing on a keyboard. When he tore the check free and held it out to her, Claire's heart nearly stopped. $50,000. "I can't take this," she said immediately, her voice coming out strangled. "Why not?" "Because it's too much. I didn't do it for money. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Grayson's expression softened. "I know. That's exactly why you deserve it." But Claire was already shaking her head, pushing the check back toward him. "No, I'm sorry, but no." He looked genuinely baffled, like he'd just encountered a problem he couldn't solve with his checkbook, and he didn't know how to process it. "Then what do you want?" he asked. "Name it. Anything." And that's when Claire's mouth opened, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Promise me something." Grayson frowned. "What?" "Promise me." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Promise me that if I ever need help, really need it, you'll be there. That's all I want. Just your word." For a long moment, he just stared at her. And then, slowly, he folded the check and tucked it back into his jacket. "You have it," he said quietly. "You have my word." He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back, a phone number, she realized. His personal number. "If you ever need me," Grayson said, pressing the card into her hand. "You call, day or night. I don't care what it is. You call, and I'll answer." Claire looked down at the card, her throat tight. "Okay." He nodded once, then turned and left the office, leaving her alone with the ghost of his promise hanging in the air. And Claire, exhausted and shaken, and still not entirely sure what had just happened, tucked the card into her pocket and wondered if she'd ever actually use it. She had no idea that 6 months later she'd be dialing that number with trembling fingers, her life falling apart around her. And Grayson Hill would do exactly what he'd promised. He'd answer. Life has a funny way of moving forward whether you're ready or not. The days after that night at Calloway's Bistro blurred together in a haze of police statements. News reporters camped outside the restaurant, and customers who suddenly wanted to sit at table 12 like it was some kind of macabre tourist attraction. The man who'd tried to spike Grayson's drink, his name was Derek Paulson. Claire learned from the news had been arrested and charged with attempted murder. Turned out, he was a disgruntled former employee of Hill Capital Management. Someone who'd been fired 3 years ago and had been nursing a grudge ever since. The story made headlines for about a week. Waitress saves tech mogul's life. Quick-thinking server foils poisoning plot. Claire's face was plastered across local news websites, though she'd refused all interview requests. She didn't want the attention, didn't want strangers dissecting her life or turning her into some kind of hero. She'd just done what anyone with a conscience would have done. At least, that's what she told herself. Grayson had disappeared from Calloway's after that night. She hadn't expected him to come back. Why would he? But part of her had wondered if maybe he'd stop by, just once, to check in. He didn't, and she told herself it didn't matter. He'd given her his promise and his card, and that was more than most people in her position would ever get. The business card stayed in her wallet, tucked behind her driver's license where she wouldn't have to look at it every day, but could find it if she needed to. She never called, never even took it out to look at the number. Because what would she say? Hi, remember me? The waitress who grabbed your drink? Yeah, everything's fine, just wanted to chat. No, the promise was for emergencies, real emergencies. And Claire's life, while far from perfect, didn't qualify. She kept working at Calloway's, kept smiling at customers and memorizing orders and pretending that her feet didn't ache and her back didn't hurt. She kept living in her tiny one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was up and coming, according to the real estate ads, which really meant still sketchy, but getting expensive. She kept sending money to her younger brother, Tyler, who was halfway through his junior year at State and constantly broke. She kept visiting her mom every other Sunday at the nursing home, sitting by her bedside and reading aloud from romance novels her mom used to love before the Alzheimer's took most of her memories. This was her life, small and quiet and unremarkable, and she'd made peace with that until she hadn't. It started with a cough, just a little thing, really. The kind of dry, nagging cough that felt like it was coming from somewhere deep in her chest. Claire figured it was allergies or maybe a cold working its way through her system. She'd been run down lately, working double shifts to cover Tyler's textbook costs, and her immune system was probably just waving a white flag. She ignored it for 2 weeks, then 3, but the cough didn't go away. It got worse, and then came the fatigue. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made climbing the stairs to her apartment feel like summiting Everest. She'd wake up in the morning already tired, like her body had forgotten how to recharge during the night. And then she started losing weight. Not the intentional healthy kind. The kind where her clothes hung loose on her frame and her co-workers started asking if she was eating enough. "You look like hell," Jenna said one night, lighting a cigarette in the alley behind the restaurant during their break. "When's the last time you saw a doctor?" "I don't know. A year ago? Maybe 2. Jenna exhaled a plume of smoke and gave her a look that was equal parts concern and frustration. "Go, tomorrow. I don't care if you have to skip a shift. Go." So Claire went. The clinic was one of those walk-in places that smelled like antiseptic and desperation, where the waiting room was always full and the magazines were always 3 years out of date. She sat there for an hour and a half before a nurse called her name, and then another 20 minutes before the doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, came in. Dr. Patel listened to Claire's symptoms, asked a dozen questions, and then ordered a chest X-ray, just to be safe. The X-ray showed something, a shadow on her left lung, small, but there. Dr. Patel's expression shifted from professional concern to something harder to read, and she ordered more tests. A CT scan, blood work, a biopsy. Claire went through it all in a daze, her mind spinning with possibilities she didn't want to name, because naming them would make them real, and if they were real, then she'd have to deal with them, and she didn't know if she could. 2 weeks later, she sat in Dr. Patel's office and heard the words that would change everything. "I'm sorry, Claire. It's cancer. Stage 2, lung cancer." The world tilted. The walls of the small office seemed to close in, and Claire felt like she was watching the scene from outside her own body. This couldn't be happening. She was 28. She didn't smoke. She ate reasonably well. She wasn't supposed to get cancer. But life didn't care about supposed to. "The good news," Dr. Patel said, though her tone suggested the good news was relative, "is that it's operable. We caught it early enough that surgery combined with chemotherapy gives you a strong chance of remission." "How strong?" Claire's voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. 70 to 80%, depending on how you respond to treatment. 70 to 80%. Those were good odds, right? That's what people would say. But all Claire could hear was the 20 to 30% chance that this thing inside her would kill her anyway. "What does treatment look like?" she asked. Dr. Patel launched into an explanation surgery to remove the tumor, followed by several rounds of chemotherapy to make sure they got everything. It would take months, maybe 6, maybe longer, and it would cost. Claire stopped listening when she heard the number. Even with insurance, her bare-bones plan that covered almost nothing, she was looking at tens of thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket expenses. Maybe more. She didn't have tens of thousands of dollars. She had about $3,000 in her savings account, and most of that was earmarked for Tyler's tuition next semester and her mom's nursing home care. "There are payment plans," Dr. Patel said gently, like she'd had this conversation 100 times before, "and financial assistance programs. We can connect you with a social worker who can help navigate—" "Okay," Claire interrupted, her voice hollow. "Okay, thank you." She left the clinic in a fog, Dr. Patel's words echoing in her head like a broken record. Cancer, surgery, chemotherapy, 70 to 80%. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel and trying to remember how to breathe. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, something about needing money for a campus event, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. Cancer. She was 28 years old, and she had cancer, and she had absolutely no idea how she was going to pay for the treatment that might save her life. The next 2 weeks were a blur of phone calls and paperwork and meetings, with hospital billing departments that all said the same thing in different ways. "Yes, this is expensive. No, we can't do much about it. Good luck." Claire tried to keep working, but the fatigue was getting worse. She'd called out sick twice already, and Paul was starting to give her looks that suggested her job security was hanging by a thread. She couldn't afford to lose this job, but she also couldn't afford to collapse in the middle of a dinner rush. Tyler called her one night, his voice bright with excitement about some project he was working on, and Claire couldn't bring herself to tell him. What would she even say? "Hey, little brother, I've got cancer, and I'm probably going to drain my savings trying not to die. So that tuition money I promised you? Yeah, that's gone." No, she couldn't do that to him. He'd worked too hard to get into college. This was his shot at a better life than the one they'd grown up with, and she wasn't going to take that away from him. Her mom wouldn't understand if she told her. The Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where she barely recognized Claire most days. Sometimes she thought Claire was her own mother. Sometimes she thought Claire was a nurse. Telling her about the cancer would just confuse and upset her. So Claire kept it to herself. She carried the weight of it alone, feeling it pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her apartment, and wondered how it had come to this. How her life had shrunk down to a single impossible question. How do you choose between saving your own life and protecting the people you love? She didn't have an answer, but then, one night, as she was lying in bed scrolling through her phone and pretending she wasn't terrified, she remembered something. A promise. A business card tucked in her wallet. A man who'd looked her in the eyes and said, "If you ever need me, you call. Day or night. I don't care what it is. You call, and I'll answer." Claire pulled herself out of bed, her hands shaking as she dug through her purse and found her wallet. The card was still there, right where she'd left it 6 months ago. She pulled it out and stared at the number written in Grayson Hill's neat handwriting. This was crazy. He'd probably forgotten all about her by now. He was a billionaire with a company to run, and a life that existed in a completely different stratosphere than hers. Why would he care about some waitress who'd grabbed his drink once? But he'd made a promise, and she was desperate. Claire picked up her phone, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a voice, deep and familiar and steady, answered. "This is Grayson." Claire's breath caught. For a second, she couldn't speak, couldn't force the words past the lump in her throat. "Hello?" Grayson said, a hint of concern creeping into his tone. "Is anyone there?" "It's Claire," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Claire Donovan, from Calloway's. I'm sorry to bother you, but you said if I ever needed help." There was a pause. And then, "Claire, what's wrong?" And just like that, the dam broke. The tears she'd been holding back for weeks spilled over, and she told him everything. The cancer, the costs, the impossible choices. She told him she didn't know what to do, that she was terrified, that she'd tried everything, and nothing was working, and she was out of options. She told him she needed help. And Grayson Hill, true to his word, didn't hesitate. "Where are you?" he asked. "Home. My apartment." "Send me the address. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "You don't have to." "Claire," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "I made you a promise. I'm keeping it. Send me the address." So she did. And 20 minutes later, when there was a knock on her door, and she opened it to find Grayson standing in the hallway of her run-down apartment building, still wearing a suit like he'd come straight from the office, she realized something. The promise she'd asked for 6 months ago hadn't been just words. It had been a lifeline, and she was about to find out just how far Grayson Hill was willing to go to honor it. Grayson Hill looked out of place, in the narrow hallway of Claire's apartment building. Not just out of place, he looked like he'd stepped through a portal from another dimension entirely. His suit probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, and the way he carried himself, shoulders back, chin up, that quiet confidence that came from never having to worry about money, made the peeling, wallpaper and flickering fluorescent lights seem even more depressing by comparison. But when Claire opened the door, and he saw her face, red-rimmed eyes, tear-stained cheeks, the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than just lack of sleep, his expression softened in a way that caught her off guard. "Can I come in?" he asked. She nodded and stepped aside, suddenly painfully aware of how small her apartment was, how shabby. The furniture was second-hand, the carpet worn thin in spots, and there was a water stain on the ceiling from when the upstairs neighbor's toilet had overflowed last year. She'd done her best to make it feel like home, a few plants on the windowsill, some framed photos of her and Tyler, a bookshelf crammed with paperbacks she'd picked up at thrift stores, but standing here with Grayson Hill in her living room, she felt like he could see every crack in the foundation of her life. "Sorry about the mess," she said, though the apartment wasn't really messy, just worn, tired, like her. "Don't apologize." Grayson's eyes swept the room, but there was no judgment in his gaze, just observation. "Do you want to sit?" They sat on her couch, a lumpy thing she'd bought off Craigslist 5 years ago, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire twisted her hands in her lap, trying to figure out where to start, how to explain the situation without sounding like she was begging. But Grayson spoke first. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out." So she did. She told him about the cough that wouldn't go away, about the doctor's appointments and the tests and the diagnosis that had felt like a death sentence. She told him about the treatment plan, surgery, and chemo, and the astronomical costs that her insurance would barely touch. She told him about Tyler, about her mom, about the impossible math of trying to save her own life without destroying theirs. And Grayson listened. Really listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't check his phone, didn't look at her like she was a problem he needed to solve as quickly as possible so he could get back to his real life. He just sat there, his dark eyes fixed on her face, and let her pour it all out. When she finally finished, her throat raw and her eyes burning, she felt hollow, wrung out, like she'd just run a marathon and collapsed at the finish line. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I know this isn't your problem. I know you probably have a million other things to deal with, and I shouldn't have called, but I didn't know what else to do. You said if I ever needed help, and I meant it." Grayson's voice was calm, steady, a rock in the middle of a storm. "Claire, look at me," she did. And what she saw in his eyes made her chest tighten. Not pity, not obligation. Something else. Something that looked almost like anger. But not at her. "How much do you need?" he asked. Claire blinked. "What?" "For the treatment. How much do you need?" She shook her head. "I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering." "How much?" I don't know exactly. The hospital said it could be anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000, depending on complications and how long the chemo takes. Maybe more. She waited for him to flinch, to realize the enormity of what she was saying and backpedal. But he didn't. His expression didn't change at all. "Okay," he said simply. "Okay? I'll cover it. All of it. Whatever it costs." Claire's heart stuttered. She must have heard him wrong. She had to have heard him wrong. "Grayson, that's too much. I can't let you—" "Yes, you can." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze intense. "Claire, 6 months ago, you saved my life. You didn't hesitate. You didn't stop to think about what it might cost you or how it might complicate your life. You just acted. And when I tried to thank you, when I tried to give you money, you refused. Do you remember what you asked for instead?" "A promise," she whispered. "A promise. You asked me to be there if you ever needed help. And here we are. You need help. So let me help you. But this is different. This is so much money. Money I have." Grayson's tone was matter-of-fact. "Claire, I don't say this to brag, but $100,000? That's not even a rounding error for me. It's nothing. But for you, it's everything. It's your life." Tears spilled down her cheeks again, and she swiped at them angrily. She hated crying, hated feeling weak. But she was so tired of being strong, of carrying everything alone, of pretending she could handle it all when she very clearly couldn't. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't have to thank me. You just have to let me do this." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. Beneath the expensive suit and the CEO persona, there was a man who understood what it meant to make a promise and keep it. A man who'd clearly been let down by people before, who'd learned not to trust easily, but who'd decided that this moment, this person was worth honoring. "Okay," Claire said finally, the word barely audible. "Okay, thank you." Grayson nodded once, then pulled out his phone. "I'm going to call my assistant. She'll get in touch with the hospital tomorrow and handle all the billing. You won't have to deal with any of it. Just focus on getting better." "Grayson." He looked up at her, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Yeah? Why are you doing this? Really? For a long moment, he didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and something flickered in his eyes, something that looked like old pain, carefully buried, but never quite forgotten. "Because 6 months ago, you saw someone in danger and you acted," he said quietly. "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything, but you stepped in anyway. And in my world, the world I operate in every day, that's rare. People always want something. They're always calculating the cost-benefit analysis, figuring out what they can get in return. But you didn't want anything except a promise, and that told me everything I needed to know about who you are." He paused, his gaze distant, like he was looking at something far away. "My father died when I was 17, Grayson continued. "Heart attack. Sudden. One minute he was fine, the next he was gone. And I remember thinking, if someone had been there, if someone had noticed the signs, had called for help faster, maybe he'd still be alive. Maybe I wouldn't have spent the last 15 years building a company just to prove I could fill the hole he left behind." Claire's throat tightened. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to open up, to share something so personal. "What you did for me," Grayson said, his voice rough. "It mattered. And I don't forget things that matter. So yeah, I'm doing this. Not because I pity you, or because I'm trying to ease my conscience. I'm doing it because you deserve it. Because people like you, people who do the right thing even when it's hard, should be protected. And if I can do that, then I will." Claire didn't know what to say. There were no words big enough to contain what she was feeling: gratitude and disbelief and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Thank you," she said again, because it was all she had. Grayson stood, smoothing down his suit jacket. "I'll have my assistant reach out to you tomorrow. In the meantime, get some rest. And Claire? Yeah? You're going to beat this. I don't care what the statistics say. You're a fighter. I saw that 6 months ago. You're going to get through this." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly. After he left, Claire sat on her couch in the quiet of her apartment and let herself cry. But this time, they weren't tears of desperation. They were tears of relief. Because, for the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of impossible choices had lifted. Just a little. She had a chance now. A real chance. And it was all because of a promise made in a manager's office 6 months ago, and a man who'd actually kept it. The next morning, Claire's phone rang at 9 a.m., sharp. The caller ID said, "Hill Capital Management." "Hello?" Claire answered, her voice still groggy from the first decent night's sleep she'd had in weeks. "Good morning, Ms. Donovan. This is Veronica Pierce, Mr. Hill's executive assistant. He's briefed me on your situation, and I wanted to let you know we've already been in contact with your hospital's billing department. All expenses related to your treatment will be directed to us. You won't see a single bill." Claire sat up in bed, her heart pounding. That was fast. Mr. Hill doesn't believe in wasting time. There was a warmth in Veronica's voice that suggested she approved of this particular use of her boss's resources. "I've also taken the liberty of researching the top oncologists in the area. If you'd like, I can arrange consultations with specialists who have excellent success rates with your type of cancer. Second opinions are always valuable." Yes. "Yes, thank you. Wonderful. I'll email you a list this afternoon. Is there anything else you need? Transportation to appointments? Someone to help with errands during treatment?" Claire's throat tightened. This was more than she'd expected. So much more. "No, I think I'm okay for now. But thank you. Really. You have my direct number now. If anything comes up, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call." After they hung up, Claire stared at her phone for a long moment. This was really happening. Grayson wasn't just throwing money at the problem and disappearing. He was making sure she had everything she needed. Making sure she had a fighting chance. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Claire spent that time getting her affairs in order, telling Paul at Callaway's that she'd need extended medical leave, arranging for someone to check on her mom at the nursing home, and finally, reluctantly, telling Tyler her brother had been furious that she'd kept it from him, then terrified, then determined to drop out of school and come home to take care of her. It had taken an hour-long phone call and a lot of tears on both sides to convince him to stay. She'd told him about Grayson's help, though she'd downplayed exactly how much he was doing, and promised she'd be okay. She had to be okay. For Tyler, for her mom, for herself. The night before the surgery, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You've got this. I'll be checking in with the hospital tomorrow." Claire stared at the message, her eyes stinging. He'd said he'd be there if she needed him. She just hadn't realized he'd mean it this literally. She typed out a reply. "Thank you for everything." His response came almost immediately. That's what promises are for. And for the first time since her diagnosis, Claire allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she really was going to beat this. She had no idea that the hardest part wasn't the cancer. It was what would come after. The surgery went well. That's what Dr. Patel said when Claire woke up in the recovery room, her chest wrapped in bandages and her head still foggy from anesthesia. "We got clean margins. The tumor's out, and the surrounding tissue looks good. You did great." Claire wanted to feel relief, wanted to feel the weight lift off her shoulders like everyone kept saying it should. But all she felt was exhausted, hollowed out, like someone had reached inside her chest and scooped out more than just a tumor. They'd taken something essential, something she wasn't sure she'd get back. The first week after surgery was a blur of pain medication and hospital beds and nurses who came in at all hours to check her vitals. Tyler drove down from school against her protests and stayed in her apartment, sleeping on her lumpy couch and bringing her terrible hospital cafeteria food that she could barely stomach. He tried to hide how scared he was, but Claire could see it in the way his hands shook when he poured her water, in the way his voice cracked when he asked how she was feeling. "I'm fine," she kept saying, a lie they both needed. Grayson didn't visit. She hadn't expected him to. Why would he? But he texted every day. Short messages, nothing intrusive. "How are you feeling? And let me know if you need anything," and once, simply, "You're tougher than you think." That last one had made her cry, though she couldn't quite explain why. Veronica called twice a week with updates on the billing all handled, nothing for Claire to worry about, and to check if she needed anything arranged. When Claire mentioned that getting to her follow-up appointments would be difficult since Tyler had to go back to school, Veronica had a car service set up within an hour. "Mr. Hill insists," she'd said, when Claire tried to protest. "He's very particular about people keeping their medical appointments." It was strange being taken care of like this. Strange and uncomfortable and deeply, achingly necessary. Because the truth was, Claire couldn't have done this alone. She would have tried, she always tried, but she would have drowned. And Grayson had thrown her a lifeline without asking for anything in return. That terrified her almost as much as the cancer had. 6 weeks after surgery, Claire started chemotherapy. If the surgery had hollowed her out, the chemo tried to erase her entirely. The first session wasn't so bad. She sat in a recliner in a room full of other people hooked up to IV drips, reading a book Tyler had brought her and trying not to think about the poison flowing into her veins. Poison that was supposed to save her. The irony wasn't lost on her, but the second session? That's when it hit. The nausea came first, a rolling, relentless wave that made her feel like she was on a boat in a storm that would never end. She couldn't eat, couldn't keep anything down. Even water felt like swallowing broken glass. Then came the fatigue, worse than anything she'd experienced before the surgery. She'd sleep for 12 hours and wake up exhausted. Her muscles ached, her bones ached. Even her hair hurt, right before it started falling out in clumps that clogged the shower drain and left her pillow covered in strands every morning. She'd known it would happen. Dr. Patel had warned her. But knowing and experiencing were two completely different things. The day she shaved her head because watching it fall out slowly was worse than just taking control of it. She'd stood in front of her bathroom mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back was pale and gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes and a skull that looked too fragile, too exposed. She'd never felt less human. Tyler came home that weekend and pretended not to notice, but she saw the way his eyes widened when he first saw her, the way he had to look away for just a second to compose himself. "You look badass," he'd said, his voice too bright. "Like that actress from that alien movie? You know the one?" "Liar," she'd replied. But she'd smiled anyway. The texts from Grayson continued. He never asked how she was doing. Maybe Veronica was keeping him updated, or maybe he just knew that question got exhausting after a while. Instead, he sent her things: articles about cancer breakthroughs, playlists of music his assistant had curated for low-energy days. Once, a package arrived with a weighted blanket inside and a note that said, "Veronica swears by this." Thought it might help. It did help, more than she wanted to admit. But Grayson himself remained a ghost. A presence felt but never seen. And Claire told herself that was fine. He'd done what he'd promised. More than what he'd promised. She had no right to expect anything else except late at night. When the nausea was at its worst and she couldn't sleep and the apartment felt too quiet, she'd find herself wondering what it would be like if he were there. Not in a romantic way, she wasn't naive enough to think that's where this was headed, but just there. A solid presence in the darkness. Someone who saw her and didn't flinch. She never let herself dwell on those thoughts for long. 3 months into chemotherapy, Claire got the call from Tyler she'd been dreading. "Hey," he said, his voice tight. "I need to talk to you about something." Her heart sank. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly. It's just, I got my tuition bill for next semester, and there's a problem with my financial aid. Something about paperwork not being filed on time, I don't know. The financial aid office is being super weird about it. But the bottom line is, I owe $8,000 by the end of the month, or I can't register for classes." Claire closed her eyes. Of course this was happening now. "How much do you have saved?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Like $200. I've been working part-time, but it's barely covering food and books and—" He stopped, his frustration palpable even through the phone. "I can take a semester off, defer, work full-time and save up—" "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "No, Tyler, you're not taking time off. You're so close to graduating. If you stop now, you might not go back." "But Claire, I can't ask you for—" "You're not asking. I'm telling you. I'll figure it out." "How?" "You can't work right now, and I know Grayson's been helping with the medical stuff, but I can't ask him for more. That's not fair to you or him. I said I'll figure it out." Her voice was firm, final. "Don't worry about it, okay? Just focus on school." After she hung up, Claire sat on her couch and stared at the wall. $8,000. She didn't have $8,000. Her savings were gone, wiped out by the expenses that Grayson's help hadn't covered: rent, utilities, food, the co-pays on medications. She'd been living off credit cards for the past 2 months, and those were nearly maxed out. She could ask Grayson. He'd probably say yes. But the thought made her stomach churn worse than the chemo did. He'd already done so much. Too much. She couldn't keep taking from him like he was some kind of ATM. There had to be a limit. A line she couldn't cross. But what other option did she have? She pulled out her phone, stared at Grayson's number in her contacts, and tried to summon the courage to call him. Before she could, her phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello? Ms. Donovan? This is Detective Morrison. We spoke 6 months ago about the incident at Calloway's Bistro." Claire's chest tightened. "I remember. Is everything okay? I wanted to give you an update on the case. Derek Paulson, The man who attempted to poison Mr. Hill, his trial is coming up. We'll need you to testify. Testify? I already gave a statement. I know, but the defense is claiming you misidentified what you saw. They're arguing that Paulson was just walking past the table and never touched the glass. We need you on the stand to refute that. Claire's hands started to shake. When? 3 weeks. I know it's short notice, but the prosecutor's office just finalized the schedule. I'll have someone reach out with all the details. Okay, she said weakly. Okay, I'll be there. After she hung up, Claire buried her face in her hands. 3 weeks. She'd be in the middle of her next round of chemo. She'd be sick and exhausted and barely holding herself together. And now she had to stand up in a courtroom and relive that night while some defense attorney tried to make her look like she'd imagined the whole thing. This was too much. All of it was too much. Her phone buzzed. A text from Grayson. Veronica told me Morrison called. I'm assuming it's about the trial? Claire stared at the message. Of course he knew. Of course he'd already been informed. She typed back, Yeah. They need me to testify. His response came immediately. I'll be there. You don't have to do that. I know. I'm doing it anyway. And just like that, something in Claire's chest loosened. Just a little. Just enough to breathe. She didn't call him about Tyler's tuition that night. She told herself she'd find another way, that she'd already asked for too much. But 2 days later, Veronica called. Ms. Donovan, Mr. Hill wanted me to reach out. He's aware that you have a brother in college. Claire's blood ran cold. How did he didn't pry, if that's what you're worried about. Your brother's information came up during the background check we ran before arranging your medical coverage. Standard procedure to identify emergency contacts and dependents. Oh. Claire didn't know whether to be relieved or mortified. Mr. Hill noticed there might be some financial strain with tuition costs, especially given your current circumstances. He'd like to offer assistance. No. The word came out reflexively. No, I can't. Before you refuse, Veronica interrupted gently. Let me tell you what he's proposing. He'd like to set up a scholarship through his foundation to cover your brother's remaining tuition and expenses. Not a loan, a scholarship, completely separate from what he's done for you. Veronica, that's incredibly generous. But, Ms. Donovan. Veronica's voice was kind but firm. I've worked for Grayson Hill for 8 years. I've seen him make a lot of business decisions, a lot of charitable contributions, a lot of investments. But I've never seen him this committed to helping someone. Not like this. He considers it a matter of honor. And when Grayson decides something is a matter of honor, he doesn't take no for an answer. Claire's throat was so tight she could barely speak. Why is he doing all this? There was a pause. Then Veronica said quietly, Because you saved his life. And because somewhere along the way, I think he decided that your fight became his fight, too. That night, Claire finally let herself cry. Really cry. Not the frustrated tears or the scared tears or the exhausted tears she'd been shedding for months. These were different. These were the tears of someone who'd been carrying an impossible weight and had finally been allowed to set it down. She didn't call Grayson to thank him. She didn't know what she'd say if she did, but she sent him a text. I don't know how to repay you. His response came an hour later. You already did, 6 months ago in a restaurant. The rest is just me keeping my word. And Claire realized, lying in her bed, in her tiny apartment with her bald head and her scarred chest and her exhausted body, that Grayson Hill had become something she'd never expected. He'd become her friend, and maybe, just maybe, he'd become something even more important than that. He'd become someone she could trust. The courthouse was one of those imposing buildings designed to make you feel small. All marble columns and vaulted ceilings, and the kind of echoing footsteps that reminded you that justice, real justice, was supposed to be bigger than any one person. Claire stood at the bottom of the steps leading to the entrance, her hands shoved deep in the pockets of the blazer Veronica had sent over with a note that said, "You'll want to look professional. This one should fit." It did fit. Perfectly. Which meant Veronica had somehow figured out her measurements without asking, and Claire was trying very hard not to think about how invasive that should feel, versus how grateful she actually was. The morning air was crisp, early spring fighting its way past winter's last gasp. Claire had finished her latest round of chemo 3 days ago, and while she wasn't actively nauseous anymore, she felt like a strong wind could knock her over. Her head was still bare. She'd opted for a simple beanie instead of a wig because wigs made her scalp itch, and she had enough to deal with without adding that to the list. Under the blazer, she wore a soft gray sweater and black pants, both loose enough to accommodate the weight she'd lost, but structured enough to look intentional. She looked sick. She knew she looked sick, and part of her hated that the jury would see her like this, would maybe wonder if she was reliable, if her memory could be trusted, when she could barely trust her own body to get through a day without betraying her. But another part of her, the part that had kept her going through surgery and chemo and all, the nights when giving up seemed easier than fighting. That part was angry. And anger, she'd learned, was a surprisingly effective fuel. Claire, she turned, and there he was. Grayson Hill stood at the top of the courthouse steps, perfectly composed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. But it wasn't the suit that made her breath catch. It was his face, the way his expression shifted when he saw her concern flickering across his features before he carefully smoothed it away. He came down the steps, his movements unhurried, and stopped in front of her. "You came," Claire said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I said I would." "I know, but I thought maybe you'd be busy or—" "Claire." He said her name like it was a period at the end of a sentence. "Final. I'm here. I'll be in the courtroom the entire time." "You're not doing this alone." Something in her chest cracked open, just a little. "Thank you." He nodded once, then gestured toward the entrance. "Detective Morrison is waiting inside. He wants to go over your testimony one more time before we go in." "We?" "I'm allowed in the courtroom. I'm a witness too, remember? I'll testify after you, right? Of course." This was his attempted murder trial, after all. She'd almost forgotten that part, too focused on her own dread about taking the stand. They walked into the courthouse together, Grayson's presence beside her like a shield against the chaos inside the crowds of people, the lawyers in expensive suits, the families of defendants and victims all tangled together in the hallways. Morrison was waiting near the courtroom entrance, looking exactly like he had 6 months ago. Tired, weathered, but sharp-eyed. "Ms. Donovan," he said, shaking her hand. "Thanks for coming. I know this isn't easy." "It's fine," Claire lied. Morrison led them to a small conference room where the prosecutor, a woman in her 40s named Angela Reeves, was waiting with a stack of folders and a laptop. She had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by any of it. "Claire Donovan," Reeves said, standing to shake her hand. Her grip was firm, professional. "I'm going to be direct with you. The defense is going to try to tear apart your testimony. They're going to suggest you were tired, that you were distracted, that you couldn't possibly have seen what you claim to have seen from where you were standing. They're going to imply that you're testifying because Mr. Hill has been financially supporting you, and that you're biased." Claire's stomach dropped. "He's been supporting me because I have cancer. Because he kept a promise, I know, and we'll make that clear. But you need to be prepared for them to twist it." Reeves opened one of the folders and pulled out a photo, a grainy still from the restaurant's security camera showing Derek Paulson walking past Grayson's booth. "This is what they're going to show the jury. You can't see his hand in this frame because of the angle, so your testimony, what you saw, is crucial." "I saw him," Claire said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. I saw his hand hover over the glass. It was only for a second, but I saw it. Good. Hold on to that certainty. Don't let them shake you. They went over the questions Reeves would ask. The questions the defense attorney, a man named Lawrence Kepler with a reputation for being ruthless, would likely ask. They talked about body language, about staying calm, about not getting defensive, even when the questions felt like attacks. By the time they finished, Claire felt like she'd been wrung out and hung up to dry. "You're going to do great," Morrison said as they left the conference room, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. The courtroom was smaller than Claire had expected, more cramped. The jury box was full 12 people who'd been pulled from their normal lives to decide whether Derek Paulson had tried to commit murder or whether this was all some tragic misunderstanding. Paulson himself sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the man she remembered from the restaurant. He'd cleaned up nice hair, neatly trimmed, suit pressed, expression carefully neutral. He looked like someone's accountant. Harmless. Claire knew better. She took her seat in the gallery next to Grayson, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Grayson didn't say anything, but his shoulder pressed against hers just barely, just enough to remind her he was there. The trial had been going for 2 days already. Reeves had called witnesses: the bartender from Callaway's, the security guard who'd reviewed the footage, a toxicologist who'd tested the substance in the vial Carter had confiscated. All of them painted a clear picture. Derek Paulson had brought poison into that restaurant with the intent to use it. But the defense had been chipping away at the edges, suggesting the vial could have been planted, suggesting Paulson's presence at the restaurant was coincidental, suggesting that everyone was jumping to conclusions because Grayson Hill was rich and influential, and nobody wanted to admit that maybe, just maybe, nothing had actually happened, and now it was Claire's turn. The prosecution calls Claire Donovan to the stand. Claire stood, her legs shaky, and walked to the witness box. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down, hyper-aware of the jury's eyes on her, hyper-aware of the beanie covering her bald head, the hollows in her cheeks, the way her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. Angela Reeves approached, her expression kind but professional. "Ms. Donovan, can you tell the court what you do for a living?" "I'm a waitress. At Callaway's Bistro." "And how long have you worked there?" 3 years. "Were you working on the night of November 14th of last year?" "Yes." "Can you describe what you saw that night?" Claire took a breath, steadied herself, and then she told the story. She described serving Grayson, bringing him his bourbon, noticing the man in the booth nearby. She described how the man had stood up, how he'd walked past Grayson's table, how his hand had dipped low and hovered over the glass for just a fraction of a second. "I grabbed the glass before Mr. Hill could drink from it," Claire said, "and I told him I thought someone had spiked it." "Why did you do that?" Reeves asked. "Because I was sure. I didn't have proof yet, but I was sure, and I couldn't let him drink it. Even though grabbing a customer's drink mid-service is unusual. Even though," Reeves nodded, satisfied. No further questions. And then it was Lawrence Kepler's turn. He stood slowly, deliberately, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the witness stand. He had the kind of face that belonged in a cologne ad, chiseled, symmetrical, with gray hair that made him look distinguished rather than old, and his smile was the most dangerous thing about him. "Ms. Donovan," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "you've been through quite an ordeal recently, haven't you?" Claire's jaw tightened. "If you're referring to my cancer diagnosis, yes. And Mr. Hill has been helping you with that, hasn't he? Paying for your treatment?" "He has." "That's very generous of him. How much would you say he spent on your medical care?" Reeves stood. "Objection. Relevance. I'm establishing the witness's potential bias, Your Honor." The judge, an older man with a perpetual frown, considered this. "I'll allow it. But make it quick, Mr. Kepler." Kepler turned back to Claire. "So, how much?" "I don't know the exact amount," Claire said. "But it's been substantial. Substantial? Would you say you feel indebted to Mr. Hill? I feel grateful. Grateful enough to testify the way he wants you to? Claire's hands clenched. I'm testifying to what I saw. Nothing more, nothing less. But you admit your memory of that night could be flawed. It was 6 months ago, after all, and according to your medical records, he held up a document, and Claire's blood ran cold. You were already experiencing symptoms of your illness at that time. Fatigue. Difficulty concentrating. Isn't it possible you were simply tired? That you saw something innocuous and your mind filled in the rest? No, Claire said, her voice firm. I know what I saw. Do you? Because the security footage doesn't show what you claim to have seen. The angle is wrong. But I was there. I saw it. Kepler smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. Or you think you saw it. Because you're grateful to Mr. Hill. Because he's been extraordinarily kind to you. And because disappointing him would mean losing that support. Objection! Reeves was on her feet. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained. The judge looked at Kepler. Move on, counselor, but the damage was done. Claire could see it in the jury's faces, the doubt creeping in, the questions forming, and Kepler knew it too. No further questions, he said, turning away dismissively. Claire stepped down from the stand, her legs barely holding her up. She walked back to her seat, and Grayson's hand found hers under the cover of the gallery bench. He didn't say anything. He just held on, and for the first time since she'd walked into that courtroom, Claire wondered if telling the truth was going to be enough. Grayson testified after Claire, and if she'd thought her time on the stand was brutal, watching him was somehow worse. Because while Kepler had tried to paint her as unreliable and biased, with Grayson he went for a different angle entirely. Mr. Hill, Kepler said, pacing in front of the witness stand like a predator circling prey. You're a wealthy man. Would you say you're accustomed to getting what you want? Grayson's expression remained neutral. I work hard for what I have. That's not what I asked. Are you accustomed to getting what you want? Most of the time, yes. And when you don't get what you want, how do you handle that? Reeves stood. Objection. Relevance. I'm establishing the witness's character, Your Honor. It speaks to motive and credibility. The judge waved her down. I'll allow it. Grayson leaned back slightly, his dark eyes fixed on Kepler with an intensity that made even the defense attorney pause. I handle it the same way anyone else does. I reassess and move forward. Do you hold grudges, Mr. Hill? No. Really? Because my client, Mr. Paulson, was fired from your company 3 years ago. And now, here we are, with him facing decades in prison based largely on your testimony and the testimony of a woman you've been financially supporting. Seems convenient, doesn't it? Derek Paulson was fired for embezzling company funds, Grayson said, his voice cold. He signed a termination agreement acknowledging his misconduct in exchange for us not pressing criminal charges. That has nothing to do with what happened 6 months ago, doesn't it? Isn't it possible that Mr. Paulson was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? That you saw an opportunity to finally punish him for his past mistakes, and you took it? Grayson's jaw tightened. I saw an opportunity to stay alive. That's all, Kepler smiled. Or Miss Donovan saw what she thought you wanted her to see, and you ran with it. After all, you've been exceptionally generous to her, paying for cancer treatment that costs, what, upwards of $100,000? Setting up a scholarship for her brother? That's quite a lot of money to spend on someone you barely know. I made her a promise, Grayson said, his voice steady but edged with steel. And I keep my promises. How noble. Kepler's tone dripped with sarcasm. But isn't it also convenient? She testifies exactly how you need her to, and in return, you take care of all her problems. Some might call that witness tampering, Mr. Hill. The courtroom erupted. Reeves was on her feet objecting. The judge was banging his gavel, and Claire felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Was that what people thought? That she'd lied because Grayson had paid her to? Grayson's eyes found hers across the courtroom, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. Not anger, not frustration, just a quiet, steady certainty that cut through all the noise. "I didn't tamper with anything," Grayson said when the courtroom finally quieted. "Claire Donovan saved my life. I helped her because it was the right thing to do. If that makes me suspicious in your eyes, counselor, then I'll live with that. But it doesn't change the facts. Derek Paulson tried to poison me, and Ms. Donovan stopped him. End of story." Kepler opened his mouth to continue, but the judge cut him off. "Move on, Mr. Kepler, now," the defense attorney smiled thinly. "No further questions." The closing arguments happened the next day. Reeves laid out the case methodically, the timeline, the evidence, the testimony from multiple witnesses, all pointing to the same conclusion. Derek Paulson had brought poison into Calloway's bistro with the intent to kill Grayson Hill, and only Claire's quick thinking had prevented it. Kepler countered with doubt. Reasonable doubt. He painted Claire as well-meaning but unreliable, a woman whose memory couldn't be trusted due to her illness and who was biased because of Grayson's financial support. He suggested the vial could have been planted by overzealous security. He reminded the jury that the security footage didn't show what Claire claimed to have seen, and that without that visual proof, they were being asked to convict a man based on the word of two people with every reason to want him in prison. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kepler said, his voice measured and calm, "I'm not asking you to believe that Ms. Donovan is lying. I'm asking you to consider that she might be mistaken, that in a moment of stress and confusion, her mind filled in gaps that weren't there. And I'm asking you to consider that Mr. Hill, a powerful man with resources most of us can't imagine, might have an agenda we're not privy to. Because if you have even a shred of reasonable doubt, and you should then, you must acquit." The jury deliberated for 2 days. Claire spent those days in a fog. She went home, tried to eat, tried to sleep. But mostly, she just sat on her couch, staring at her phone and waiting for Morrison to call. Grayson texted her periodically, "Hang in there, and whatever happens, you told the truth." But he didn't call, and she didn't reach out to him either. Because what would she say? On the 3rd day, Morrison called. "They've reached a verdict," he said. "Can you get to the courthouse in an hour?" Claire's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the phone. Yeah, I'll be there." She got dressed in the same outfit she'd worn for her testimony armor, of sorts, and caught a cab to the courthouse. Grayson was already there when she arrived, standing in the hallway outside the courtroom with his hands in his pockets and his expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked when he saw her. "No," Claire admitted. "Are you?" "No." They stood there for a moment. Two people bound together by a promise and a poisoned drink and the weight of a verdict that would determine whether they'd been right or whether they'd destroyed an innocent man's life. "Whatever happens," Grayson said quietly, "thank you for what you did that night, for testifying, for all of it." Claire nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They filed into the courtroom and took their seats. The jury filed in 12 faces, carefully blank, giving nothing away. Derek Paulson sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He didn't look at Claire, didn't look at Grayson, just stared straight ahead like he was bracing for impact. The judge entered, and everyone stood. The formalities were observed, the judge asking if the jury had reached a verdict, the foreman standing to deliver it. "We have, Your Honor." "And how do you find?" The foreman, a man in his 60s with kind eyes, looked down at the paper in his hands. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom exploded. Paulson's face went white, then red, and he lunged halfway out of his seat before his attorney grabbed him and forced him back down. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, and bailiffs moved in to restrain Paulson as he shouted something Claire couldn't quite make out over the noise. But she heard one word, one name, hers, Paulson's eyes locked onto her across the courtroom, and the hatred in them was so visceral it made her recoil. "This is your fault," he screamed, his voice raw. "You ruined my life. You and him, you destroyed me." The bailiffs dragged him out, still screaming, and the courtroom slowly settled into a stunned silence. Claire sat frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Guilty. They'd found him guilty. She'd been right. She'd told the truth, and the jury had believed her. So why did she feel like she was going to throw up? Grayson's hand found hers again, squeezing gently. "It's over," he said quietly. But it wasn't. Not really, because as they left the courthouse dodging reporters who shouted questions about the verdict, about their relationship, about whether justice had truly been served, Claire realized something. Derek Paulson would spend the next 20 years in prison. Her testimony had put him there, and whether or not he deserved it, and he did, she knew he did, she would have to live with that weight for the rest of her life. That night, Claire sat alone in her apartment, staring at the wall and trying to process everything. The trial, the verdict, Paulson's face as they dragged him away. She should feel relieved, vindicated. But all she felt was exhausted and hollowed out and desperately in need of something she couldn't name. Her phone rang. "Grayson," she answered. "Hey, how are you holding up?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I keep thinking about the way he looked at me, like he wanted to kill me." "He does," Grayson said bluntly. "And that's exactly why he's in prison." "Claire, you did the right thing. You have to believe that." "I do. I think I do. It's just, I know." His voice softened. "It's a lot, and I'm sorry you had to go through it." They were quiet for a moment. Then Grayson said, "I want to see you." Claire blinked. "What?" "I want to see you. In person. Not at a courthouse or a hospital or anywhere else where the world is falling apart. Just see you. Can I come over?" She should say no. Should tell him she needed time to process. Needed space. But the truth was, she didn't want to be alone right now. And maybe he didn't either. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, come over." He arrived 20 minutes later, still in his suit, but with his tie loosened and his jacket slung over his arm. He looked as tired as she felt. The careful mask he usually wore cracked just enough to show the human underneath. They sat on her couch, the same lumpy couch where this whole thing had started 6 months ago, and for a long time, neither of them spoke, and then Grayson said, "I need to tell you something." Claire turned to look at him, her heart suddenly in her throat. "Okay." "When you called me that night, when you told me about the cancer, I almost didn't answer." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I saw your name on the screen, and for a second, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. Because I knew if I answered, if you needed something, I'd have to follow through on the promise I made. And I wasn't sure I could handle that. Being responsible for someone again." "Grayson, let me finish." He ran a hand through his hair, his expression raw. "I lost my father when I was 17. And for years after that, I threw myself into building the company, into proving I could fill the space he left. But I never let anyone get close, never let anyone depend on me. Because if they depended on me and I failed—" He trailed off, his jaw tight. "But you didn't fail," Claire said quietly. "No, but I almost did. Almost walked away from the promise I made you because it was easier than risking failure." He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "And then I answered. And I helped you. And somewhere along the way, you stopped being an obligation and became—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Important. You became important to me, Claire." Her breath caught. "Grayson, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know. You saved my life, and then somehow you saved something else too." Claire didn't trust herself to speak. So instead, she reached out and took his hand. And they sat there, two broken people who'd somehow found each other in the wreckage, and let themselves believe just for a moment that maybe they could be whole again. The weeks after the trial should have been a time of healing, should have been a return to something resembling normal. Claire finished her chemotherapy, 6 rounds total, each one taking a little more out of her until she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. But Dr. Patel was optimistic. The follow-up scans showed no signs of remaining cancer cells. The surgery had been successful. The chemo had done its job. "You're in remission," Dr. Patel said, smiling that cautious smile doctors wore when they'd seen too many people celebrate too early. "We'll keep monitoring you closely, but this is very good news, Claire." Remission. The word should have felt like freedom, like a door opening onto a future she'd thought she might not have. And part of her did feel that relief, the bone-deep, soul-shaking relief of someone who'd stared death in the face and somehow backed away intact. But another part of her, a part that was growing louder with each passing day, felt untethered, lost, like she'd been fighting so hard for so long that now, without an enemy to battle, she didn't know what to do with herself. She tried to go back to work at Calloway's. Paul had held her position, though she suspected that had more to do with Grayson making a very generous donation to the restaurant than any loyalty to her. Her first shift back was a disaster. She lasted 3 hours before the exhaustion hit her like a truck, and Jenna had to practically carry her to the back office and force her to sit down. "You're not ready," Jenna said, not unkindly. "Give yourself time." But time felt like the enemy now. Time meant sitting in her apartment with nothing to do but think. Think about the trial, about Paulson's face twisted with rage, about Grayson's confession on her couch. "You became important to me," and the way her heart had stuttered when he'd said it. Grayson had backed off after that night. Not coldly, not with any sense of regret. But there was a distance now, like he'd shown her something vulnerable and needed space to rebuild his walls. He still texted less frequently, but still there. "How are you feeling? And Veronica says your scans were clear. Congratulations." But he didn't come by, didn't call, and Claire told herself that was fine, that she didn't need him hovering, that she could handle this on her own. Except she couldn't, because 3 weeks into remission, 3 weeks into trying to figure out who she was when she wasn't actively dying, Claire got a call from the nursing home. "Ms. Donovan, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Your mother's condition has deteriorated significantly over the past few days. The doctor believes she may only have a few weeks left." The words didn't register at first. Didn't make sense. Her mom had been stable for months. The Alzheimer's was progressing, yes, but slowly. This was supposed to take years, not weeks. "What happened?" Claire asked, her voice hollow. "She stopped eating 3 days ago. We've tried everything, but she's refusing food and water. At this stage, with her condition, forcing nutrition would only prolong her suffering." "I'm so sorry." Claire drove to the nursing home in a daze. The facility was nice, nicer than most. Thanks again to Grayson's assistance in covering the costs. But it still smelled like antiseptic and old. Age and the particular kind of sadness that came from warehousing people who'd outlived their own memories. Her mother was in room 214, a small space with a window overlooking a courtyard that probably looked cheerful in summer, but now, in early spring, just looked gray. The woman in the bed didn't look like Claire's mom. She looked like a husk, a shell. Her hair, once the same dark auburn as Claire's, had gone completely white. Her face was gaunt, her skin papery. She stared at the ceiling with cloudy eyes that didn't seem to see anything at all. "Mom?" Claire said softly, pulling a chair up beside the bed. No response, not even a flicker of recognition. Claire took her mother's hand, so fragile, it felt like it might crumble under her touch, and tried to think of something to say, something meaningful. But what do you say to someone who doesn't remember you? Who doesn't remember herself? "It's Claire," she tried. "Your daughter. I just wanted to see you." Nothing. Claire sat there for 2 hours, holding her mother's hand and talking about nothing. About the weather. About Tyler and how well he was doing in school. about the trial and the remission and all the things that had happened since the last time she'd visited. Her mother never responded, never even blinked. When Claire finally left, the nurse caught her in the hallway. "She may not be able to communicate, but I believe she can still hear you. Talk to her. Read to her. It might bring her comfort." Comfort. The word felt like a joke. What comfort was there in dying slowly? Your mind already gone, your body just catching up. Claire drove home and sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment building for 20 minutes, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Everything was falling apart. She'd survived cancer, put a man in prison, and watched Grayson Hill become something she couldn't quite define: friend, savior, something more. And now her mother was dying, and there was nothing she could do about it. She pulled out her phone, stared at Grayson's number, and almost called him. Almost. But what would she say? "Hi, my mom's dying, and I'm falling apart, and I need you to fix this too?" No. She'd already taken so much from him. Too much. There had to be a limit, a line she couldn't cross. She put the phone away and went inside. Her mother died 4 days later. Claire was there when it happened, sitting beside the bed and reading aloud from one of the romance novels her mom used to love. She didn't know if her mother could hear her, didn't know if any part of the woman who'd raised her was still in there. But she read anyway, because it was all she had left to give. And then, in the middle of a sentence about a hero and heroine finally confessing their love, her mother took one last shallow breath and simply stopped. The nurse came in and confirmed it. Time of death, 3:47 p.m. Claire sat there for another hour, holding her mother's hand even though it was already growing cold, and felt nothing, just numb, hollowed out. The funeral was small. Tyler came home, red-eyed and shell-shocked. A few of their mother's friends from before the Alzheimer's showed up, though Claire barely recognized them. She stood at the graveside and listened to a minister she'd hired recite generic platitudes about eternal rest and reuniting with loved ones, and felt like she was watching it all happen to someone else. Grayson came. She hadn't told him, hadn't even thought to tell him. But somehow, Veronica, probably he'd found out. He stood at the back of the small gathering, wearing a dark suit and an expression of quiet grief. And when the service ended and people started to drift away, he approached her. "Claire," he said softly. "I'm so sorry." She nodded, unable to speak. "Is there anything you need?" She shook her head. Then, before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "Why are you here?" Grayson frowned. "Because you shouldn't have to go through this alone." "But I am alone," Claire said, her voice cracking. "Don't you get it? My mom's gone. Tyler's going back to school. You've got your life and your company and your world that I don't fit into. And I'm just here. Alone. Like always. Claire." "I can't keep doing this," she said, the words coming faster now, fueled by grief and exhaustion, and something that felt dangerously close to desperation. "I can't keep taking from you. Can't keep being the person you save, because you feel obligated to honor some promise you made when you barely knew me. I need to figure out how to stand on my own. And I can't do that if you keep swooping in to fix everything." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Is that what you think this is? Obligation? Isn't it?" For a long moment, he just looked at her. And then he said, very quietly, "No, it's not." But Claire was too far gone to hear him, too lost in her own spiral to see the hurt flashing across his face. "I think you should go," she said. "Claire, please, just go." And he did, because that's what Grayson Hill did when someone told him to leave. He respected boundaries, gave people space, even when it was the last thing either of them needed. Claire watched him walk away, watched him disappear into the gray afternoon, and felt the last thread holding her together finally snap. The next 2 weeks were a blur. Claire stopped answering her phone, stopped checking her texts. She moved through her days like a zombie, sleeping too much, eating too little, and spending most of her waking hours staring at the walls of her apartment and wondering how her life had become this. Tyler called. She didn't answer. Jenna called. She didn't answer. Grayson called. 3 times. She didn't answer. And then, on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after her mother's funeral, there was a knock on her door. Claire almost didn't answer, but the knocking was persistent, and eventually she dragged herself off the couch and opened the door. It wasn't Grayson. It was a woman, mid-30s, blonde, beautiful, in that polished, expensive way that screamed old money. She wore a cream-colored coat and held a designer handbag that probably cost more than Claire's car. "Claire Donovan?" the woman asked. "Who's asking?" The woman's smile was sharp, predatory. "My name is Victoria Ashton. I'm Grayson Hill's fiancée." The world tilted. "His what?" "Fiancée," Victoria repeated, like the word wasn't a bomb she'd just dropped into Claire's life. "We've been engaged for 3 months now. It hasn't been announced yet. Grayson's very private about his personal life, as I'm sure you know. But I thought it was time we met." Claire's brain couldn't process this, couldn't make it make sense. "Why?" Victoria's smile widened. "Because I know what you've been doing. The cancer story, the trial, the sob story about your dead mother. You're very good, I'll give you that. You had Grayson completely fooled, but I see through it." "I don't know what you're talking about, don't you?" Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to something that would have sounded sympathetic to anyone listening, but was laced with venom. "You latched onto a wealthy, generous man and bled him dry. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, all for someone he barely knows. And why? Because you saved his drink at a restaurant? Please, you saw an opportunity and you took it. But it's over now. Grayson and I are getting married, and I won't have you sniffing around trying to get more money out of him." Claire felt like she'd been punched. "Get out." "Gladly. But understand this, stay away from Grayson. Stop calling him. Stop texting him. Stop making him feel responsible for you. He's moved on, and it's time you did the same." Victoria turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing in her doorway, her entire world crumbling around her. Fiancé. Grayson had a fiancé, and Claire, foolish. Broken Claire had somehow convinced herself that what they had was real, that his promises meant something more than obligation, that maybe, just maybe, he saw her as more than a charity case. She closed the door, slid down to the floor, and finally let herself shatter completely. Claire didn't leave her apartment for 3 days after Victoria's visit. She existed in a fog of humiliation and grief so thick she could barely breathe through it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victoria's perfect smile, heard that poisonous voice saying "fiancé" like it was a weapon designed specifically to cut Claire down. She replayed every interaction with Grayson in her head, searching for signs she'd missed. Had he mentioned Victoria? Had there been clues she'd been too naive, too desperate to see? The texts, the phone calls, the way he'd shown up at the hospital and the courthouse and her mother's funeral, had all of that been guilt? Obligation? A rich man's way of keeping his conscience clean while building a life with someone else? The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that she'd let herself hope. She'd started to believe that maybe someone like Grayson Hill could actually care about someone like her, that the connection between them was real, that she mattered to him as more than just a debt to be repaid. She'd been so stupid. On the 4th day, her phone rang. Tyler. She'd been ignoring his calls, but he was persistent, and eventually guilt won out over the desire to hide from the world. "Finally," Tyler said when she answered, his voice tight with frustration and worry. "Do you have any idea how freaked out I've been? You haven't answered in almost a week." "I'm fine," Claire said automatically, her voice hoarse from crying and disuse. "You're not fine. You sound like hell. What's going on?" "Nothing. I just needed some time alone." "Alone?" Tyler's voice rose. "Claire, Mom just died. You shouldn't be alone. I can come home, take a few days off. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. No, Tyler, you need to stay in school. I'm fine. Really. You're lying. I'm not. Yes, you are. You always do this. You act like you can handle everything by yourself, like you don't need anyone, and then you fall apart when no one's looking. Talk to me, please. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him, wanted to pour out the whole sorry story. Victoria's visit, Grayson's engagement, the crushing realization that she'd misread everything. But saying it out loud would make it real, would turn her private humiliation into something she'd have to acknowledge. I just need more time, she said finally. I promise I'm okay. I'll call you in a few days. Tyler sighed, clearly unconvinced. Okay, but Claire, if you need me, if you need anything, you call. I don't care about classes or exams or any of it. You're more important. After she hung up, Claire sat on her couch and stared at her phone. She should delete Grayson's number, should erase every text, every reminder of the fantasy she'd built in her head. But her thumb hovered over his name in her contacts, unable to press delete. Before she could talk herself out of it, she opened their message thread and scrolled back through months of conversations. Short texts, mostly. Professional. Kind. But there, buried among the updates about doctor's appointments and trial dates, were moments that had felt like more. Like when he'd texted her after a particularly brutal chemo session. Strength isn't about not falling down. It's about getting back up every time you do. You're one of the strongest people I know. Or when she'd sent him a photo of her and Tyler at her apartment, both of them smiling despite everything, and he'd replied, He's lucky to have you. You're both going to be okay. She'd read too much into those messages, had let them feed a hope that was never based in reality. Claire was about to put the phone down when it buzzed in her hand. A text from an unknown number. Sad to see you in peace. Donovan, this is Veronica Pierce. I need to speak with you urgently. It's about Mr. Hill. Please call me as soon as you can. Claire stared at the message, her heart hammering. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to cut all ties and move on with whatever remained of her life. But another part, the part that had never been good at leaving things unfinished, couldn't resist. She called. Veronica answered on the first ring. Ms. Donovan, thank God. Are you all right? The concern in her voice caught Claire off guard. I'm fine. Why? Because Grayson's been trying to reach you for days and you haven't responded. He's been worried sick. He's been worried. Claire's voice came out bitter. That's funny, considering he's been busy getting engaged. There was a long pause. Then Veronica said, very carefully, What are you talking about? Victoria Ashton came to see me. She told me she and Grayson are engaged, that I needed to stay away from him. Another pause, longer this time. When Veronica spoke again, her voice had gone cold in a way Claire had never heard before. Victoria Ashton came to your apartment? Yes, 4 days ago. And she told you she was engaged to Grayson? Yes, Ms. Donovan Claire. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Victoria Ashton is not engaged to Grayson Hill. She never has been. She's someone Grayson dated briefly about 6 months ago, before the incident at the restaurant. He ended things with her because, well, that's not my story to tell. But they are not together. They are not engaged. And if she told you otherwise, she's lying. Claire's world tilted again, but in the opposite direction this time. She's lying? Completely. Grayson doesn't even know she came to see you. When he finds out, Veronica cut herself off. Claire, can you come to the office? Today? I think you need to hear this from him directly. I don't know if that's a good idea. Please, just trust me. There are things you don't know. Things Grayson should have told you but didn't, because he's an idiot when it comes to his personal life. There was affection in Veronica's exasperation. He's here now. Come to the office. Let him explain. Claire wanted to say no, wanted to protect herself from whatever fresh humiliation might be waiting. But beneath the fear and hurt, there was still a thread of something else. Hope, maybe, or just the desperate need to know the truth. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll come." Hill Capital Management occupied the top 3 floors of one of the city's most prestigious buildings. Claire had never been here before, had never had any reason to enter Grayson's world. The lobby was all marble and chrome and floor-to-ceiling windows that made her feel like an ant in a terrarium. She gave her name to the receptionist, a polished young woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, and was directed to an elevator that required a key card to access the executive floors. Veronica met her when the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor. She was exactly what Claire had imagined: blonde, professional, with kind eyes that suggested she'd seen Grayson Hill at his worst and his best, and had chosen loyalty anyway. "Thank you for coming," Veronica said, shaking Claire's hand. "He's in his office. This way." They walked down a hallway lined with abstract art and offices occupied by people in expensive suits doing important things. Claire felt intensely out of place in her jeans and sweater, her beanie pulled low over her growing back hair. She didn't belong here, had never belonged here. Veronica stopped in front of a set of double doors. "He doesn't know you're here yet. I thought it would be better to just bring you in. Less time for him to prepare a speech, and more time for honest conversation." "Veronica, he cares about you," Veronica interrupted gently. "More than I've seen him care about anyone in the 8 years I've worked for him. Whatever Victoria told you, whatever doubts you have, just hear him out, please." Then she opened the doors. Grayson's office was massive, probably bigger than Claire's entire apartment. One wall was entirely windows, offering a view of the city that made her breath catch. The furniture was sleek and modern, all clean lines and expensive materials. And behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a museum sat Grayson, his head bent over a laptop, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. He looked tired. More than tired, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Veronica, I told you I didn't want to be disturbed unless—" He looked up and stopped mid-sentence when he saw Claire. His expression shifted through surprise, relief, and something that looked almost like fear. "Claire!" "Hi," she said, her voice small. Grayson stood immediately, coming around the desk. "What are you doing here? Are you okay? I've been trying to reach you. I know. I'm sorry. I just needed—" She trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. Veronica cleared her throat. "I'm going to leave you two alone. Grayson, tell her everything." Then she left, closing the doors behind her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Grayson looked like he wanted to come closer, but wasn't sure if he was allowed. Claire stayed rooted near the door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Victoria came to see me," Claire said finally. Grayson's expression darkened immediately. "What? 4 days ago. She came to my apartment. She told me you two were engaged." "We're not." The words came out sharp, definitive. "Claire, we're not engaged. We're not even together. We dated for 3 months, and I ended it the week before the incident at the restaurant. She didn't take it well. Why didn't you tell me about her?" "Because she wasn't relevant," Grayson said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Because what she and I had, it wasn't real. It was just 2 people going through the motions because it looked right on paper. And when I tried to end it, she made it very clear she didn't accept that." "What do you mean?" Grayson ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tight. "She's been calling me for months, showing up at places she knows I'll be, telling people we're still together, that we're working through things. I've had my lawyers send cease and desist letters, but she ignores them. And now she's coming after you." He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you, should have told you about her. But I didn't want to bring my mess into your life when you already had so much to deal with." Claire's mind was spinning. "So, you're not engaged?" "No." "And you haven't moved on?" "No." He took a step closer. Claire, the reason I didn't call after your mother's funeral, the reason I gave you space, is because you asked me to. You told me to go. You said you needed to figure things out on your own, and I respected that, even though it killed me to walk away. But you made that promise, Claire said, her voice shaking. You said if I ever needed you, and I meant it. I mean it. But you pushed me away, and I didn't know how to fight for something you didn't want. I did want it. The words burst out of her, raw and desperate. I wanted you there. I wanted your help and your texts and your stupid ability to show up exactly when I needed you. But then Victoria came and told me you were engaged, and I thought I'd been an idiot, that I'd convinced myself you cared about me when really I was just a promise you felt obligated to keep. Grayson closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. You are not an obligation, he said, his voice low and intense. You never were. From the moment you grabbed that glass, from the moment you risked your job and your safety to save my life, you became something else entirely. And every day since then, every moment I've spent helping you or thinking about you or lying awake worrying about whether you were okay, it hasn't been out of obligation. It's been because He stopped, his jaw working like he was fighting with himself. Because you what? Claire whispered. Grayson looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, all his walls were down. All the carefully constructed distance was gone, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Because I fell in love with you, he said quietly. Somewhere between that night at the restaurant and watching you fight through cancer and holding your hand at the trial, I fell completely in love with you. And I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. Didn't want you to think that helping you came with strings attached. But Claire, if you think for 1 second that you're just a promise I'm keeping, you're wrong. You're so much more than that. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Grayson, I should have told you sooner. Should have been honest instead of hiding behind excuses about boundaries and giving you space. But I'm telling you now, I love you. And if you need me to prove it, if you need me to spend the rest of my life showing you that you matter to me, that you're the most important thing in my world, then that's what I'll do. And Claire, who'd spent months convinced she didn't deserve this man's help, let alone his love, finally let herself believe it was real. I love you too, she whispered. Then she closed the distance between them and kissed him. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 3 months later, Claire stood in front of the mirror in her apartment and barely recognized herself. Not because she looked sick, though the ghost of that illness still lingered in the slight hollowness of her cheeks, the delicate way her hair was growing back in soft curls that were darker than before, but because she looked happy. Actually, genuinely happy in a way she couldn't remember being since before her mother got sick. Before the cancer diagnosis, before life had become a series of impossible choices and desperate prayers. Her hair had grown enough that she didn't need the beanie anymore. It was short, pixie length, and she'd stopped trying to hide it. Grayson said it made her eyes look bigger, made her look fierce. Tyler said it made her look like that actress from that action movie he loved. Claire just thought it made her look like someone who'd survived something that should have killed her and came out the other side stronger. You almost ready? Grayson called from the living room. Almost, she called back, smoothing down the dress Veronica had helped her pick out last week. It was simple navy blue, fitted but not tight, hitting just above her knees. Nothing fancy, but it felt like armor and freedom all at once. She walked out to find Grayson standing by her couch, looking devastating in a dark gray suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He'd gotten more comfortable in her apartment over the past few months, no longer looking like a visiting dignitary from another planet. He kept a spare change of clothes in her closet now, a toothbrush in her bathroom. His coffee mug had a permanent spot next to hers in the dish rack. They hadn't talked about him moving in, hadn't talked about what came next. They were taking it slow, feeling their way through this relationship that had started with a poisoned drink and evolved into something neither of them had expected. But it worked. Somehow, impossibly, it worked. "You look beautiful," Grayson said, his dark eyes soft. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." He crossed to her and took her hands, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. "You sure you're ready for this?" Claire took a breath. "Yeah, I think I am." Today was the day she was going back to Calloway's. Not to work, not yet, though Paul had made it clear her job was waiting whenever she was ready. Today was different. Today was about closure. They drove to the restaurant in Grayson's car, a sleek black sedan that felt obscenely expensive compared to her beat-up Honda that was currently gathering dust in her apartment complex's parking lot. The city scrolled past the windows, spring finally asserting itself after a long winter. Trees were budding. Flowers were pushing up through the dirt in planters along the sidewalks. The world was waking up, and so was she. Calloway's looked exactly the same as it had that night 8 months ago. Same Edison bulbs, same jazz filtering through hidden speakers, same polished hardwood floors and tables draped in white linens. But Claire felt completely different walking through those doors. Paul spotted them immediately and came rushing over, his face splitting into a genuine smile. "Claire, it's so good to see you!" And Mr. Hill. He shook Grayson's hand with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for celebrities and people who'd donated obscene amounts of money to keep restaurants afloat during scandals. "Paul," Grayson said, his tone professional but warm, "thank you for accommodating us." Of course, of course. Your table is ready. Table 12, as requested." They followed Paul through the dining room only half full on this Wednesday afternoon, and Claire's heart started beating faster as they approached the corner booth. The booth where this had all started, where she'd served Grayson his bourbon and noticed a man with slicked-back hair walking past with murder in his pocket. She slid into the booth, and Grayson sat across from her, exactly where he'd been sitting that night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other across the table, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down like a physical presence. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been working that night?" Grayson asked quietly. "Every day," Claire admitted. "But then I remind myself that I was working. I did see it, and everything that came after the good and the bad, it all happened because of that moment. Do you regret it? Any of it?" Claire considered the question. The cancer, the trial, her mother's death, Victoria's visit, the weeks of thinking she'd misread everything, that she'd been a fool to hope for more. It had been brutal, soul-crushing, the kind of pain that changed you fundamentally. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it, because if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here. With you, and that," her voice caught. "That's worth everything else." Grayson reached across the table and took her hand. "I need to tell you something." "Okay." "Victoria's been arrested." Claire's eyes widened. "What?" "Restraining order violation. Harassment. She showed up at my office last week and tried to force her way past security. They called the police. She's facing charges." His jaw tightened. "I should have done it sooner. Should have protected you from her before she ever came to your apartment. But I wanted to handle it quietly. Thought I could manage it without escalating. I was wrong. Grayson, that's not your fault. It is, though. I put you in danger because I was trying to maintain control, trying to keep my private life contained. And that's not fair to you. So I'm telling you now, no more secrets. No more compartmentalizing. If something affects me, it affects us. And you deserve to know about it." Claire squeezed his hand. "Us? I like the sound of that. Yeah?" "Yeah." Jenna appeared at their table, a knowing smile on her weathered face. "Well, well. Look who's back." And with company, I see, Claire laughed. Hi, Jenna. Hi yourself. You look good, kid. Really good. Jenna's eyes flicked to Grayson. And you taking care of her? Trying to, Grayson said. Good, because if you don't, you'll have to answer to me. And trust me, I'm scarier than any boardroom full of executives. But her smile was warm, approving. What can I get you to? They ordered bourbon for Grayson, water for Claire, and the chef's special to share. It felt surreal, sitting here like normal customers when the last time they'd been in this configuration, someone had been trying to commit murder. But it also felt right, like they were reclaiming this space, taking something that had been dark and violent and turning it into something else entirely. While they waited for their food, Grayson pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. What's this? Claire asked. Open it, she did. Inside was a check. But this time, instead of being made out to her, it was made out to the Callaway's Bistro Staff Emergency Fund. I talked to Paul, Grayson explained. Set up a fund for employees who face medical emergencies or other financial crises. Anyone who works here can apply for assistance. No questions asked. It's funded in perpetuity, will never run out. And it's named after you. Claire's throat tightened. Grayson, I know you didn't want the money when I first offered it. But this way, it's not about you. It's about making sure other people like you who work hard and do the right thing, don't have to choose between their health and their bills. It's about making sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else who can't afford to fight. Tears blurred Claire's vision. I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me run it. Help me make sure the money actually goes to people who need it. That we're not just throwing money at a problem, but actually solving it. Of course I will. Their food arrived, and they ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. About Tyler, who'd called last night to tell Claire he'd been accepted into a graduate program with a full scholarship thanks in no small part to the recommendation letter Grayson had written on his behalf. About Claire's latest scan, which had come back clear for the third month in a row. About Grayson's company, which was launching a new initiative to fund cancer research, specifically lung cancer in young adults. About the future they were building together, one day at a time. After they finished eating, Grayson reached into his pocket again. But this time, what he pulled out wasn't an envelope or a check. It was a small velvet box. Claire's heart stopped. Wait, she said quickly. Grayson, if you're about to— I'm not proposing, he interrupted gently. Not yet. I know we're taking this slow, and I respect that. But I wanted to give you something. A promise. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, not an engagement ring, just a simple band in white gold with a single small diamond set, flush in the metal. Understated. Beautiful. 8 months ago, Grayson said quietly, you asked me for a promise. You asked me to be there if you ever needed me. And I gave you my word. This ring— He took it out of the box and held it up to the light. This is that promise. Made tangible. I want you to wear it and know that no matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, I'm keeping my word. I'm here. For you. Always. He reached for her right hand, not her left. She noticed and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. When the time comes, Grayson continued, his eyes locked on hers. When we're both ready, I'll ask you the big question. But until then, I want you to have this. A reminder that you're not alone anymore. That you have someone in your corner who loves you and will fight for you and with you, no matter what. Claire couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She looked down at the ring on her finger, this physical manifestation of a promise made in a restaurant office 8 months ago, and felt something shift inside her. The last piece of armor she'd been carrying, the last wall she'd built to protect herself from hoping too much, from wanting too much, finally crumbled. I love you, she whispered. I love you too. They left Callaway's an hour later, walking out into the spring afternoon hand in hand. Claire's right hand, the one wearing Grayson's promise, was warm in his grip. And for the first time since her mother's death, since the cancer diagnosis, since her entire world had fallen apart and been slowly rebuilt, she felt whole. Not because Grayson had fixed her, not because his money had solved her problems or his love had erased her pain, but because she'd learned something crucial through all of it. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Strong enough to fight for her life. Strong enough to stand in a courtroom and tell the truth, even when it was terrifying. Strong enough to let someone in, to accept help, to believe that she deserved love and support, and a future that wasn't just about survival. And Grayson, this man who'd made a promise and kept it, who'd shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. He hadn't saved her. He'd walked beside her while she saved herself. That night, back at Claire's apartment, they lay tangled together on her couch, watching a movie neither of them was really paying attention to. Claire's head rested on Grayson's chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and she twisted the ring on her finger absently. "Hey," she said softly. "Yeah? Thank you. For everything. For keeping your promise." Grayson's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for asking me to make it. You changed my life, Claire, in ways you can't even imagine." "How?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, before that night at the restaurant, I was going through the motions. Building a company, making money, checking boxes that society said mattered. But I wasn't living. I was just existing. And then you came along and reminded me what it meant to care about someone more than the bottom line. You reminded me that promises matter, that people matter, that I could be more than just a CEO with a 9-figure net worth. I could be someone who made a difference in a way that actually meant something." Claire lifted her head to look at him. "You make it sound like I did you a favor." "You did. The biggest one anyone's ever done for me." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "You saved my life twice, Claire. Once when you grabbed that glass, and again when you let me be part of yours." She kissed him then, slow and sweet, and full of all the words she couldn't say. And in that moment, in her tiny apartment with her lumpy couch and her second-hand furniture, Claire understood something profound. Home wasn't a place. It wasn't wealth or security or even survival. Home was this person, this promise, this love that had grown from the most unlikely of circumstances and proven to be the strongest thing she'd ever known. 8 months ago, she'd refused a huge tip and asked for a promise. Instead, and Grayson Hill had kept his word. But more than that, he'd given her a future worth fighting for, and that was worth more than any amount of money in the world. 1 year later, the wedding was small. Just family and close friends gathered in the garden of a restaurant that meant more to them than any cathedral or grand ballroom ever could. Calloway's had agreed to host the ceremony in their courtyard, the same space Claire used to pass through on her smoke breaks when the dinner rush got too intense. Tyler stood as Claire's man of honor, his eyes suspiciously bright as he watched his sister walk down the makeshift aisle. Veronica sat in the front row next to Detective Morrison, who'd become an unexpected friend over the past year. Jenna was there too, dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin and muttering about allergies. And at the end of the aisle stood Grayson Hill, looking at Claire like she was the only person in the world. She wore a simple white dress, nothing fancy, because that wasn't who they were. Her hair had grown back fully, falling in soft waves just past her shoulders. On her right hand, she still wore the promise ring. On her left hand, soon, would be another ring, one that meant forever. When she reached him, Grayson took her hands and whispered, "You ready for this?" "With you?" Claire smiled. "Always." The officiant, an old friend of Grayson's father, began the ceremony. But Claire barely heard the words. She was too focused on the man in front of her, on the impossible journey that had brought them here. From a poisoned drink to a promise, from cancer to remission, from loneliness to love. When it came time for the vows, Grayson spoke first. "Claire," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "a year and a half ago, you saw someone in danger, and you didn't hesitate. You didn't calculate the risk or worry about the consequences. You just acted. And in that moment, you didn't just save my life. You showed me what it means to be truly brave. Brave enough to care. Brave enough to fight. Brave enough to love. And I promise you, for the rest of my life, I will honor that bravery. I will stand beside you through every challenge and every triumph. I will keep every promise I make, and I will love you with everything I have. Always." Claire's turn came, and she looked at this man who'd become her partner, her best friend, her home. "Grayson," she said, her voice shaking just a little, "you kept your word. Even when it cost you more than you probably expected. Even when it would have been easier to walk away. You stayed, and you showed me that I was worth fighting for, that I was worth loving, not because of what I could give you, but just because of who I am. And I promise you, for the rest of my life, I will never take that for granted. I will stand beside you. I will challenge you and support you and love you through everything. Because you're not just the man who kept his promise. You're the man I choose, every day, for the rest of my life." The rings were exchanged. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. And when Grayson kissed her, the small crowd erupted in applause. But Claire barely heard it. She was too busy kissing her husband, too busy thinking about the future stretching out before them, bright and full of possibility. A year and a half ago, she'd been a waitress barely scraping by, convinced she was alone in the world. Now she was Claire Hill, cancer survivor, wife, partner, fighter, and she'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can ask for isn't money or security or even survival. Sometimes the most valuable thing is a promise, and the most valuable person is the one who keeps it. Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments, and tell us what would you have asked for instead of the tip.